Good evening. I want to welcome you to our Heat Core Town Hall on school safety, trauma, and conflict resolution. My name is Annette Anderson, and I am the Deputy Director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Safe and Healthy Schools. This evening, we have with us three significantly invested members of our local Baltimore community here to talk about these very personal and pivotal issues. We are going to talk about how this issue of school safety and trauma and conflict resolution continue to be a primary issue coming through and out of this pandemic. We are excited that we have such wonderful guests this evening, and we want to have our guests have an opportunity to address the issue of gun violence in our schools, how processing trauma is impacting our youth, and what we need to do in order to keep our schools and communities safe. This town hall is the second part of our ongoing HEAT, Gun Violence and School Safety Town Hall series. And at this time, I would like to introduce our three panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Zeke Cohen. Zeke Cohen has represented the 1st District on the Baltimore City Council since 2016. After graduating from Goucher College, he taught in West Baltimore, and as a teacher, he was awarded the Elizabeth Lawrence Prize for Excellence. He attained a master's degree in public policy from Johns Hopkins University. Zeke started his nonprofit, The Intersection, to help young people learn community organizing and civic leadership. He ran for office with the belief that democracy only works when everyone has a voice in the process. In July 2019, Zeke introduced the Elijah Cummings Healing City Act, making Baltimore the first city in the country to comprehensively legislate trauma-responsive care. The bill, which was signed into law in February of 2020, so right before the pandemic began, and the movement that propelled it forward were created to help Baltimore heal from our enduring legacies of trauma, racism, and violence. Since entering office in 2016, his office has resolved over 2,800 separate constituent requests for assistance. These include requests for help resolving water bill disputes, removing abandoned boats from vacant lots, I'm sure that's an interesting story or two, and expediting the repair of broken streetlights. Zeke believes in the power of organized communities, and in the past 2 years, his office created community-driven task forces on the topics of transportation and public safety. Welcome, Councilman Cohen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. Honored to be with you.
It's an honor to have you. Our second panelist this evening is Mrs. LaQuisha Hall. Mrs. Hall has dedicated 18 years to the Baltimore City Public Schools system. A literacy educator and now coach, she holds an English bachelor's degree from Elizabeth City State University and a secondary education master's degree from Morgan State University. LaQuisha mentors via Queendom TEA, the Etiquette Academy, a program she founded to empower young ladies. An award-winning, best-selling author of multiple books, LaQuisha has published more than 100 scholars and anthologies, including One Nation, One Heart, winner of the National Indie Authors Legacy Award for Young Authors of the Year. LaQuisha also won Baltimore City Teacher of the Year in 2018 and was a finalist at the state level. Also, she neglects to say this, but she was also the subject of Melinda Anderson's book about her. She encourages educators to practice self-care because they cannot pour into scholars from an empty cup. Welcome, Mrs. Hall.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. I'm being humble.
Well, you have done so much.
Thank you.
Yes, she is the best in the business. And then finally, our third guest is no stranger to those of us in the Heat Corps. Dr. Panagis Galiatsatos is an assistant professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in the Division of Pulmonary and Critical Care Medicine. He is co-chair of the Johns Hopkins Health Equity Steering Committee and is the co-director and co-founder of Medicine for the Greater Good, a novel medical initiative impacting over 10,000 Baltimore City lives in regards to health and wellness, while at the same time creating physician citizens. His clinical responsibilities center on critical care services in adult populations and he is also the director of the Tobacco Treatment Clinic at Johns Hopkins Medicine, the associate director of the Hereditary Hemorrhagic, I'm going to mess this word up. You put that in to trip me up.
Telangiectasia. It's all right. No worries, Dr. Anderson.
Say that one more time.
Telangiectasia.
Telangiectasia Center of Clinical Excellence and physician in the obstructive lung disease group at Johns Hopkins Medicine and in the post-COVID-19 acute care clinic. Welcome, Dr. G.
An honor to be here amongst you and amongst everyone here and amongst our community. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I want to say to all of our guests who have tuned in from far and wide, thank you. Many of you have followed us on multiple town halls, and we thank you for this growing following as we continue to talk about the issues that matter most in our community and across the nation and around the world. I want to invite you to put your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A, because we want this to be an interactive conversation. Please let us know what you are thinking. Please ask your questions. We are looking forward to asking those questions of our distinguished guests this evening. So as we get started, I want to start with you, Councilman Cohen. If you would, please share with us a little bit about the Elijah Cummings Healing City Act and what led you and your team and your community partners to bring this forward. And once you describe that, if you'd also just spend a few moments talking about what does trauma responsive care mean and why is that important, particularly for those of us who live and breathe and love Baltimore. And then what would you say has been the impact of your legislation in this great city? Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Dr. Anderson. It's really an honor to be with you and my other two friends and heroes on this panel who just are doing extraordinary work in our city. So we, in 2019, and it's amazing because so much of the violence and so much of the conversation in our city feels cyclical in that it was actually a school shooting that had prompted this legislation. Folks may or may not remember that in 2019 at Frederick Douglass High School, a gentleman walked into the school with a gun and actually shot one of the school staff during school hours. And, you know, this was an incredibly traumatic event for our community. Students had to duck in place. Teachers described hearing the bullets, seeing bloodshed. And unfortunately, after this really horrific incident, there wasn't much of an organized response. It felt like to a lot of the teachers that were there in particular, and the students as well, that no one really knew what to do. And so the conversation, as it often does, turned to how could we be more safe? And a lot of the adult discourse, the adult conversations at the time turned to, should school police be armed while they're walking around in school buildings, which has resurfaced as a conversation recently, as well as should we increase the amount of metal detectors? And so we decided to hold a hearing in the Education and Youth Committee of the City Council. And the title of the hearing was Youth Violence, Youth Voices. And the idea was to really turn the microphone to our young people and hear what they thought, particularly young people who are most impacted by violence. Because what we often see in Baltimore is that the people who are most proximate to the problems that we have too often don't get a say in the solution, which is really backward, because we know that young people, older adults, folks who have lived in this city, who've grown up in it, who've experienced the good, the bad, and the ugly have so much to contribute, but we have not done enough to provide a platform. So we held this hearing, and the young people really wanted nothing to do with the increased policing conversation. In fact, they turned to us, the city council, and said, look, you all are spending too much of your time, energy, and money talking about how to better police us. What you need to do is talk about how to prevent this type of violence from occurring in the first place, and not just this one-off horrible, but really rare thing that happened in our school, but day-to-day instances that we experience around food insecurity, housing instability, violence that we see in our neighborhood, just the day-to-day grind of growing up Black in one of the birthplaces of redlining, which is Baltimore City. I mean, it was remarkable, Annette, because the young people named every single ACE. You know, I didn't even know the vocabulary at the time, but every single adverse childhood experience in the book, they talked about personally what that was like and charged us with legislating, coming up with a law to address that, not just the metal detectors, but the trauma that fuels violence. And as a former teacher, you mentioned in my bio, I taught in West Baltimore and in South Baltimore. You know, for me, anytime I hear young people speaking with that level of precision and clarity, not only do we need to listen, but we need to make sure that they are driving the work. And so I reached out to them after the hearing and said, listen, I think it's great what you said, but instead of me just going back and writing a bill, why don't we work together on this? Let's spend some time and energy trying to figure something out. And so young people were kind enough to say yes. And we spent about a year in libraries, in laundromats, in rec centers, in classrooms. I feel like we were in Ms. Hall's class at one point, just trying to listen and understand what we could do to reduce trauma among our young people. And what we came up with was the Elijah Cummings Healing City Act. And we were really proud that a year later, we went back to Frederick Douglass High School, and Mayor at the time, Jack Young, signed the bill right there at their school. And I'll never forget Brianna, Jayana, and Damani speaking not only about what it was like to have lived through this horrific, traumatic experience, but to then have really taken their power back and not only spoken out at a hearing, but helped to write legislation, which ultimately, as you mentioned, made Baltimore first in the country to have legislated around this issue. And we've now seen 8 other cities that have reached out to us and said, we also want to do legislation around trauma. And so it's kind of become this global movement. Just really quickly to your other 2 questions, the impact of the legislation, we are training every city agency in trauma responsive care. We started with our library system. We did a very, very deep dive. We spent about a year working with librarians. Due to that training, they had a zero tolerance policy for anyone that was thought to have used drugs or alcohol within the last 24 hours, where the policy was you just kick them out. But we know in 2024 that addiction is a disease and that it is often linked to people's past trauma. And so instead of kicking people out, what we decided to do is to bring peer recovery coaches into our libraries. And so starting in Penn North, if you go there now, there's a peer navigator who helps folks get Narcan if they need it, treatment, housing, whatever you need, because we believe in harm reduction. We also have an incredible task force, which I'm honored and proud to get to serve with my friend, Dr. Panagis over here in our medical subcommittee. We were able to secure $1.5 million for Baltimore Crisis Response, which is our city's mobile crisis response unit. Panagis and other folks have been organizing with our hospital systems to try to make sure we are aligned with our city and our hospitals around a trauma-informed approach. And then what was the last part of the question?
Just thinking about the impact. So I think you've answered all of that. I'm just curious about whether you would say that you have been able to see a sizable change because, this legislation passed right before the pandemic started, right? And so how fortuitous that happened. So having, just briefly, if you could respond to the impact that this has had, because you all were ready, I guess you would say.
Yeah, I mean, I'll never forget
pandemic.
doing a press thing, and then literally at the same press thing, the mayor turned around and said, "Okay, now it's COVID-19, and everybody needs to start washing your hands and not touching each other." I mean, literally on the same day. So yeah, global events have impacted how we've been able to implement this legislation. But in some ways, Annette, I think it was, I'm a spiritual person, and I think there was some divine intervention in that. I think that so much of what we are currently experiencing, not just in Baltimore, but across the country and across the world, is a profound mental health crisis that is impacting, of course, our kids, our elders who were forced to do the most social distancing during the pandemic, really all of us. And so I think that having COVID happen, while obviously no one wants to try to implement a new law in a pandemic, I think was really important because it forced us to pivot to, I'll never forget doing trainings with the library where we had 450 people on a Zoom. And because of technology, you can do that. As Panagis knows, we've done most of our trauma-informed care task force meetings by Zoom. But I actually think that the impact is both immediate, but also hopefully generational, because this is long-term work. And as any of those of us that are kind of on the front lines as it relates to trauma knows, this problem was not created in a year or in a day, and it will not be solved in that amount of time. And so it is a long game. And for me, I think about the kind of city that I want my daughter, who's at a Baltimore City Public School now, she started pre-K this year, and I want my son to grow up in. And that's a world where we have really confronted some of our past practices, whether it's housing inequality, whether it's the war on drugs, or just inflicting trauma on primarily communities of color, and that we've really put our entire shoulder, our entire effort into healing our city. So I believe there has been both, some immediate impact, but also I think about, that this is a long game, and this is going to take a concerted amount of effort by all of us to get there.
Thank you. We'll come back to you and have a few more questions for you. So, Mrs. Hall, you have been a classroom teacher. And because you have had such deep personal relationships with so many of your students, and you have such an active following on social media, you've been very transparent about some of the highs of those deep relationships and then the impacts of some of those lows. And it has been very, very impactful to me to see you be so transparent about what it means to be on the ground in a time like this, when our young people, as Councilman Cohen just said, they are dealing with so much trauma from the pandemic. And so can you tell us a little bit about how you think the pandemic has affected our young people and what your experience has been, because you have kept up like every great educator, you have kept up the relationships with your students, who even your former students who have come out of the school system, and you've gotten to see some of them flourish and fly. And then there have been other students that have just been heartbreaking. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yes, so first, thank you for having me here with all this greatness. And I'm really honored to have been asked, even from the position that I sit in, because I am an educator, and a lot of times we're not asked what we think, how we're feeling, and what we think should happen in order to make the progress that's needed. And so I think right now I'm in a space where, one, I don't feel that gun violence is a school issue. It is definitely a national issue. And if we keep only focusing on schools, then we'll miss those hot spots where gun violence is prevailing, like in our urban cities and communities, which is even another conversation around how urban communities are treated, how they're supported, how they're resourced, how they're funded. Some of that was referenced by Councilman Cohen a few minutes ago, but even all the way down to things like, we ask school districts to do more, but you have students come into buildings where the government, if their mother has to stay in Section 8 housing, can't have their father in the space. And so how do we start there? You're asking a child who was broken, sometimes in the home, to come into a school and get the help. Like, we need the help from the people enacting and enforcing these laws that set Black families back. And that's just the truth of the matter, is that the gun violence comes from a lot of people not realizing and internalizing their own worth. And so they're seeking that externally, and a lot of times that comes out through frustration, which people call criminal. And it's incredibly unfortunate and unfair, because our students are key witnesses to this. They are experiencing it because they're losing their own family and friends. And then, of course, as we've seen recently, not in schools, but outside of schools, they're losing their lives. And so until we find a way to treat all people as if they're valuable and help all people see their worth, then we're not going to see a shift. And honestly, even I love the initiatives that are happening. We have initiatives in Baltimore City schools. We have Councilman Cohen doing this great trauma work. We have all these things happening. But unfortunately for me, a lot of times that feels like, oh, you have a wound. Let's cover that wound. But I'm going to put you back in the war after I cover your wound. Like, we need to really look at the fact that there is a group, an entity, and faction of people in the world who benefit from Black trauma and poor mental health. There are people benefiting financially from the experiences that cause so much harm in our communities. And until that's addressed, we just want to have Band-Aids on wounds, and we're going to be put back into this war. And that's incredibly unfair and unfortunate. And as a result, I have, as you mentioned, I've lost more than 10 scholars over 3 years, and none of them were killed inside of a school. None of them. And all of them grew up in these circumstances that I'm describing. I distinctly remember some of even the challenges that Jasmine, who was shot the night of his prom, had gone through as a freshman before he even got to his junior year. And so when we think about how to help young people, it can't just be at the school, because where is their hope? Where are the ideologies and the experiences and the opportunities that we see in other communities for other young people? They don't exist everywhere. And so we're actually being, I think, unfair to our young people by expecting them to perform all these great things and be quote unquote normal with uncircumstantial experiences and lifestyles. It's like I'm only going to give you half of what I've given this community, but I expect you to still be a whole person, and that's incredibly unfair.
Yeah. And tell me how this, cumulatively, I have lost a few former students, and not to gun violence, but one in particular early in my career to suicide. And to this day, I always think about, what could I have done differently? What could I have said? I mean, that as an educator, you will always carry that love for your students so poignantly. And so I'm curious about how all of this has impacted you and fellow educators on the ground. What has it been for the people who are walking this walk every day?
I personally feel incredibly frustrated often. I have found it, just this year alone, I've lost 3, and I just feel like we need them in these conversations. We can't keep sitting high and deciding what they should do in low space.
Yes. Well, it's a very powerful statement. And as I said, I think all of us who care deeply about this city, we are all really wrestling right now with what this means for us as people who love the city, and people who are, deeply invested in community, people who are raising children in the city, people who are deeply connected to the history and to the traditions and the culture of our city. So I do appreciate your willingness to be transparent. It is a incredible lift for so many. And so I just want to thank you and every educator who walks into our school buildings every day with a loving heart and a wonderful intention of making sure that our young people get what they need, because the role, I say this over and over again, the role of the trusted adult in our schools cannot be overstated. So I do want to say thank you, and I will give you a moment and move on to you, Dr. Galiatsatos. We've talked a little bit about trauma. We've talked a little bit about what it means for our young people to experience these high levels of trauma, and the fact that the pandemic has not made that easier for our young people. So we talked a little bit about what it means for social emotional development and what it means for the mind, but can you speak to what trauma does to the body and why it is also really important for us to be aware of the impact that the conflict and the continued trauma is having on our young people physically?
Yeah, no, happy to, Dr. Anderson, and just, sitting and listening to Councilman Cohen and to Ms. Hall, if we aren't moved to make things better, because we're all reacting, that's the frustrating part, whether it's the teachers, the councilmen, or the physicians. We're literally putting the Band-Aids on the wounds and sending people back out. It's incredibly frustrating with this always reaction and reaction. The question you pose, I'm going to answer it in this context, because many of us kind of sit back and reflect, is like, in this, like, what can we change to some extent as a culture, both for ourselves and then ultimately for our patients? And why that's going to be important is because one of the most frustrating things about medicine, and I am going to knock down my specialty overall, we put so much emphasis on the physical, on the somatic, right? I think, by 8 years old, my 8-year-old daughter knows if you have chest pain, you should call 911. You call the doctors. You don't ignore it. If you're short of breath, you don't ignore this stuff. What do we teach them about mental health? What do we teach them about talking about their emotions, about getting that out there? We have breast cancer month coming up. Feel a lump, talk to your doctor. Nothing from our field says, hey, make sure you talk about your emotions. They might be appropriate. They might be an appropriate reaction to the situation. You still should talk to someone. Maybe they're becoming more pathological. Still, again, we have never as a medical community said, make sure how you feel is expressed. And that, I don't blame people for not reacting to it in that fashion. I blame medicine for never putting mental health to the same priority, the same level as these other physical conditions and ailments. It's almost impossible to find someone over the phone. If you call me, like, I have chest pain, I'm going to say 911, go, ED. If I get the same phone call from a patient, it's like, I'm really not feeling well, doc. We're not trained to have that conversation of, well, let me hear what his mental health is. And we need to do better to put that as a focus, because it can't rely on a primary care, can't rely on a psychiatrist. Goodness knows, we don't have that many of those amazing specialties. This should be the responsibility of every physician to be trained in that. And that's one of the things we can start taking on. Because what does trauma do to the body? A variety of things, of many, many things. One of them that I'll pluck here was Dr. Anderson in the, you introduced us all in the beginning. And, it took 15 minutes because we're all accomplished. And I love that, right? We're representing Baltimore. These accomplishments are Baltimore based. One of them you mentioned, director of tobacco treatment clinic. You're like, how is this in the context? The majority of my patients who come and smoke, come from areas of the city that have the highest homicide rates.
Mm.
It is not a coincidence that places with the highest smoking prevalence also have the highest violent rates. Their reaction to that is smoking. If you talk to them, living in a constant feel of a war zone, I mean, what did we give our soldiers when they went out to war? Cigarettes.
Wow.
That's what a lot of the community does in order to just stay calm. They smoke. So trauma, from a hormonal imbalance to just pathological reactions and behaviors, a lot of inappropriate projection, it does harm. And it would be its own hour. So I will finish with this. Working with teachers like Ms. Hall, working with councilmen like Councilman Cohen, the significance here is that healthcare needs to reassess its prioritization of mental health. It needs to train doctors how to have these conversations in real time, how to address these symptoms in real time, and how do we promote it to the community so they know how to do it, right? People should have this ability to react, because if we don't, we're asking not only, as Ms. Hall put it, let these kids go into this new norm, but to keep it bottled up. And it's going to create adults that have their childhoods lost on them. And that's my biggest fear. So we as a healthcare institute need to do better.
So who is responsible for helping our young people and our schools to curb the violence that we have been seeing in and around our schools? So I know that, Mrs. Hall, you were saying a moment ago that you don't think that teachers should have to bear the brunt because they are hired to be instructors, not counselors. But I also know that for so many young people who have come through traumatic experiences, having a teacher as a trusted adult has made all of the difference. And I hear back now from my students from years and years ago who are now adults themselves that my willingness to listen to what was going on with them and what was going on at home and trying to then find supports, that's what every good educator does. So, you know, who needs to really be accountable in this conversation for how we help our young people to unpack all of this trauma? And to, as Dr. G said, you know, when you talked about that, the smoking example, Dr. G, that's very powerful because so many people are very quick to dismiss that as a bad habit. And because it gets dismissed so quickly, we don't understand it as an underlying manifestation of anxiety, depression, and trauma. So whose responsibility is it to help to mediate that? So I'm going to throw this out to all three of you. And I just want to let you know, we have lots and lots of questions coming in from the audience. So I need to get to those questions too. But so I don't want us to spend too much time on this question, but I just know that, you know, this is something that I think we all should try to opine on.
I just want to say quickly, Dr. Anderson, that this should be what we say or call a village effort. It should not be the school district. It should not just be the doctor's office. It should not just be the councilman's office. We all should be collaborating in our spaces independently and then coming together collaboratively to figure out how the pieces fit. I would like to strongly say that in schools, kids need to go there to be educated. Like, we have things that we are concerned with on the day-to-day, and adding this on top of it is incredibly unfair to educators.
So then who else do you want to help out with that?
I want to see all of the people here that represent a different group in their own spaces doing the work to support. And I also want to see conversations being held with people who are benefiting from the trauma, for their understanding of why they need to be okay with leveling with the people that they've benefited from.
It's very powerful. Thank you. Councilman Cohen?
First, I completely agree with Mrs. Hall's comment about it being a village and that there is no single person. I mean, we know, to your point, Dr. Anderson, that one of the best protective factors in mitigating the impacts of trauma is a safe relationship with an adult. And that could be your teacher, or that could be your baseball coach, or that could be your janitor, or that could be your physician or your city council person. That's what I think to me stands out in all the research I've read around how to effectively mitigate trauma, is that so much of it is about relationships and is about safety and security and transparency, and all of these things that I do believe every single one of us can do more. From my lane, to me, it really is about policy. We got here because of policies and practices that created a deeply inequitable, unequal, racist city, right? I mean, we were in 1910, the first city in the country to have legislated residential segregation into city code. My forefathers, and they were all men, did that. And that's policy. I mean, we talk a lot about sort of what individuals need to do and what, the teacher or the cop or whoever needs to do. But I think policy is incredibly important in the way that it impacts not just individuals, but entire communities and our entire city. We know that we had racial housing covenants where neighborhood associations banned Black and often Jewish people from participation or from just living there. We had some of the worst blockbusting of anywhere, us, Chicago, Detroit. Moving forward in the 90s and 2000s had horrific subprime lending that caused massive depletion of Black wealth in really middle and working class neighborhoods, where I called you doctor, she is a doctor, but Mrs. Hall's point, folks profited, banks profited off of the suffering and the depletion of wealth of primarily Black and just working class people who thought that they were getting a home with $0 down and no interest for the first 3 months of the loan. And then all of a sudden it's 8% interest and 12 and then 24%. And, financial institutions that are still here in our city profited from that
predatory behavior.
And the result is mass suffering. So to me, I think there is a real role for legislation, whether it's the Healing City Act or whether it's just work around affordable housing. Some of the work that my colleague, councilmember Ramos, who also serves on our task force, is doing with inclusionary housing. I think that there's a tremendous need. I think that as Dr. Galiatsatos said, that the medical community has a real role to play. Maybe Mrs. Hall and I disagree on this a little bit, but I also do think that educators do have a tremendous impact, because I've been in your classroom and I've seen the magic that you're able to do. And it's not magic because you actually do it with young people. And if we could replicate your ability to relate on a really human, authentic level with children, whether we call it restorative practices, whether we call it trauma informed, whatever. But the thing that you do where you get kids, and it's all over her social, so you can go check it out, but where you get kids to be their most true, authentic, honest selves and have vulnerable conversations, I think that's really powerful. And I think if we could have more healing within our rec centers, our libraries, our schools, all of our institutions, I think we'd be a better city for it.
Thank you. Dr. G, quickly.
Quickly, yes. I'm going to just take what you guys have said. I mean, I will say the responsibility that I'm going to mention is not because they're causing it, but we should all, back to Ms. Hall, as a village, feel accountable for creating safe spaces for trauma responses. The medical community 100%, but housing units, transportation, if we don't put that on them to feel responsible, Because when you get these outcomes in the school, when you trace it back, you're like, yeah, all these factors come into play. Lack of jobs, lack of good access to food, lack of a feeling of belonging. You get everyone to feel accountable, then I feel you begin to fight back. That's it. I mean, too much siloed entities feeling like, well, that gun violence doesn't affect me, I'm going to maintain the bus routes. No, it affects you. It does. Own up to it, like, and come together. Like Ms. Hall, I love how you said, independently and then collectively.
Yeah.
We got to do that as a one Baltimore.
I agree deeply with you, Dr. G, because I know that if we own every child in the city collectively, I think that's the beginning of the change. We have to say every child, every young person in the city belongs to me, and I have to be willing to commit to that. Now, there will be people that don't agree with that approach, but I do believe that if we really want to see change, we've got to have relationships and we've got to have connections with every young person in this city. So I thank you so much for sharing that.
Dr. Anderson, real
yes.
quick, can I just add quickly that the people that are offering this to young people will also need the support as well. We can't just keep helping and uplifting the young people without the help ourselves.
Yes, I would agree with that as well. We need to have layers of scaffolding and support for everyone who's engaged in this work. Because as Dr. G said, there's a lot of trauma that's coming out of this. As Councilman Cohen said, there are a lot of ACEs. And so people are seeing for the first time that we are just having higher levels of all kinds of trauma, well, whether it's suicide ideation, anxiety, depression. We're seeing an increase in fentanyl use amongst teenagers. All of these things are connected. As we have said, they're COVID adjacencies. They're not just caused, they're not actually caused by COVID-19, but because this has exacerbated the situation that so many of our young people were facing before the pandemic, they are dealing with this in a much more stringent fashion. So I want to get to, with the time we have remaining, we have quite a few questions from our viewers. I want to thank you again for your questions. Please continue to put your questions in the Q&A so that we can ask them of our guests. We have a guest, Councilman Cohen, who specifically would like to ask how they can get in touch with your office because they want to connect on the restorative actions that your office has been involved in. How can someone reach out to your team to be connected to this work?
Thanks for that. Zeke.Cohen@baltimorecity.gov. I'll put it in the chat. I promise you we will get back to you. And I read my email. So just please reach out. With the task force that Dr. G and I serve on, there are members that were appointed by the mayor, but it's also kind of an open policy. So Panagis has brought a number of his students that he mentors, as well as residents and fellows, and we just have folks show up all the time, and it's kind of a get in where you fit in kind of situation. So, if there's a specific sub area, whether it's medical or education or policy, if there's something that you're passionate about, we will connect you with that subcommittee for sure. But yeah, would love to, whoever that person is, definitely please reach out, and I'll put my email in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So we have another question from a guest who has said, some kids see this in their community. What is available for our students in the after school space to help to reduce the chances of violence? One of the things that we have seen is that there's a challenge around conflict resolution that our young people have not necessarily, and we don't know whether this is informed by the pandemic or because of the pandemic, but they have not had the social, emotional, developmental space to practice conflict resolution skills as we want them to. And so being at home for the last year for many has kind of impacted them and perhaps stunted our young people's ability to practice those skills. What kinds of suggestions do you have in terms of after school opportunities or community engagements that our young people can become involved in to help reduce the opportunity for conflict resolution to not work well? How can we help them to practice good conflict resolution skills?
Can I give one example to this, and then I'll turn it over to my
Oh,
colleagues?
absolutely.
So, one of the beautiful benefits I have of doing the community engagement work that we do through Medicine for the Greater Good is we engage with amazing entities throughout the city. One of them is the Mac Lewis Gym. It's not too far from Hopkins Hospital. It invests in getting young men and women learning about boxing, but it's more than that. It teaches them about sportsmanship. It's beautiful. I'm their gym doctor. I help out when they have competitions, and seeing the respect and the sportsmanship they convey is beautiful. But they will tell you it's not just teaching boxing; it's just teaching life lessons. They bring these kids in after school. They're there. They're working out. They're mentored and coached by adults from the city, and that is huge, right? Getting that kind of respect, getting that kind of immediate feedback from an adult goes a long way. I mean, our educators, our teachers, you guys do this. And, listening to the people who run the gym, they will tell you this isn't about boxing. Yeah, they box, but it's keeping them off the streets. It's giving them life lessons, and it's teaching them these skills that will make them better adults. And the adults there become better adults for training these kids. It's one just simple example of just taking something that just builds relationships, of just owning to the community there. It's just, I say this, because it's just such a beautiful thing when you go and witness it. And these are good kids. They just want direction. They want direction, and they want a place to get this out, even if it's in the form of exercise. So I just want to drop that, because I'm hoping that begins spinning the wheels of recognizing this doesn't have to be complicated to some extent, right? We can start with just the things we're good at. I'm going to pass it over to my colleagues.
Well, and I think it's important. I think your perspective is important, because Dr. Galiatsatos, you were born and raised in Baltimore, and you attended not Baltimore City Schools, but Calvert Hall. So we will give you a pass there, but you still were very much Baltimore engaged and involved. So you have seen this up front and personally. And so I think it does speak pretty powerfully to your own experience, that you recognize that this is a need that we have in the community. So thank you for sharing that. Councilman Cohen.
Yeah, so I put a few organizations that work in the after school space in the chat, not a comprehensive list at all. Just some of the groups that I know and love that do this kind of work. So the Nolita Project, Community Law in Action, Wide Angle Youth Media, Healing Youth Alliance, Bridges, Thread, Elevate, Project Numa. And there are like a million other that will come to me as soon as this conversation is over. I'll also say that we're making a big push right now with our rec centers. They are the next agency to get trained in trauma-informed care. We really want to transform our recreation spaces into rec and healing spaces. We know that when we listen to young people, they'll say that some of our rec centers are great, others are less great, and can feel less welcoming to girls, to kids, LGBTQ kids, to kids who just identify differently and don't necessarily want to play basketball in a gym. And so we got to make sure that we are welcoming all children, and that the space is safe for everybody. And so we've just started that conversation. We're really excited to partner with Director Reggie Moore and really go deep with them. And I will just say that while we were doing our listening tour with the Healing City Act, one of the sessions that I'll never forget was in speaking to rec center directors and just listening. And this goes to, I think, what folks were saying before about secondary trauma, or sort of the trauma that we as practitioners, educators, doctors experience ourselves from engaging with our communities. I'll never forget this woman telling me about how she had lost 3 students to gun violence within the same 6 months. And while she was talking to me, her hand started to tremble. And, you could literally see her own traumatic experience and how deeply impacted she was by losing children. And so I think to LaQuisha's point, we know that not only are our kids suffering, but the folks who serve our kids, the folks who work with our kids every single day are suffering and struggling as well. And so it's really incumbent on us. And that's why in our trainings, we emphasize mindfulness, which is an evidence-based practice to help folks, to either meditate, do yoga, and any of the ways that we can address our own healing from trauma. We emphasize restorative practices. You mentioned in the question, we want to make sure that, in our rec centers, in our public spaces, that we are teaching young people conflict resolution and de-escalation. And I'll just say, and then I'll end here, what I find really, really deeply frustrating is that so much of the violence that I see in our city and in my district is stuff that starts at a very small interpersonal, petty level, and then escalates and often finds itself on social media, either on Instagram or TikTok or Twitter or whatever. And then at that point, it becomes communal, and it's all different people, and folks are weighing in on all sides. And then the abundance of guns in our city makes it so that all you need to do is go get your gun, and you can either take someone's life or injure them in a way that they will be forever paralyzed. And it all started with something that could have been mediated, that could have been resolved, that could have been de-escalated. And so that's why, to me, it's so important that all of us are practicing what it means to be restorative, what it means to listen and engage and ask thoughtful questions, and that we're teaching it in our public spaces as well. So
I want to go back to that, because I do think that you raise a very, very important point about social media. Most parents don't have the capacity to see what their children are doing on social media. And so, what would you say is, as you just very, so well laid out how this escalates so quickly, and then it becomes very impossible or difficult for young people to find a way out of it or get out of that. What do you suggest for parents who are not looking at their kids' social media, don't know what their Instagram pages or Facebook pages, or what would you suggest that parents be doing about social media for their kids right now?
Yeah, I think this is unfortunately a really, really tough problem that we've allowed to be created. So much of the way the algorithms of Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and YouTube function is they work on anger and rage and hysteria and misinformation. And, we've seen how, whether it's neo-nationalism and white supremacy, or just conflict of all different stripes, are able to gain an audience, gain traction, and then blow up. I think there's two distinct problems. One is around bullying, which we know there's an enormous amount of on social media. And, I remember when we were growing up, you would, even if you got bullied, it sort of, you went home and then it ended, and you played football or you played video games or whatever. And then, but now it is omnipresent. It's 24/7. It's constant. It's on your phone and it's in your face. And I think that to Dr. G's point, that when we think about what that does in terms of depression and anxiety and all forms of mental illness, I think it's horrible. And then there's the piece about violence, where, again, conflicts that could have been squashed, could have been mediated, are now feel like they're life or death, even though it started with something as insignificant as
Yep.
you know, you stepped on my foot, or we
Walking
got
in the
into
hallway. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think there's a lot that needs to be done at the
Well,
federal level to rein in social media companies. I know that's not what the question you asked, but I really do think that Facebook, like all, you know, Mr. Zuckerberg, all of these folks have made enormous amounts of money and created just a monster that is poisoning our democracy. But in terms of what parents can do, and I'm figuring this out myself because I got a 4-year-old and I'm like keeping her all the way away from the phone. The only thing she can watch is Bluey right now, which I think she's watching upstairs because her dad is derelict and still working. But I think
that's what happens. But that is exactly how this happens. Parents are busy trying to keep a roof over their kids' heads.
Right.
And so they're concerned about the physical health and well-being of their young people. And so this is how this is really happening. And I also think that our young people don't understand the permanence of the decisions that get made when they don't understand how to resolve conflict and when they don't involve adults to help them to unpack some of that.
That's right.
So that's also something that is having a tremendous, tremendous impact on why we're seeing these incidents happen, because I don't think our young people realize that this is permanent. When they get engaged in some of these situations, it's very difficult. I need to do a time check as host. We have so many comments from our viewers. I'm just blown away by the response of our viewers. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for sending in the questions. I need to ask our 3 panelists if they are willing to stay on for an additional 15 minutes so that we can try to get to a few more of these questions, because we have, I mean, our viewers have just sent in so many questions, and I want to make sure that we can try to get to as many of them as possible. So thank you all for being willing to stay just a few more moments. But this is it's a needed conversation. We need to have this as community. We need to have it as educators. We need to have it as healthcare professionals. We need to have it as parents. We need to be having this conversation because it is happening in front of our eyes. And we are saying that we don't know what to do, but talking about this issue, making it front of mind, and making sure that everyone feels like they have a part to play and engaged in it is the first step to us really unpacking what we need to do to curb this and to making our schools safer and to making our community safer. All right, I want to get to our next question. Our next question says, we tell our kids not to fight, but words can hurt just as much as physical violence. And it doesn't mean that violence cannot escalate. What are some suggestions that we should have on what we should be telling our youth, our children, our young people, even adults, about managing emotions so violence doesn't escalate? Dr. G talked a few moments ago. He gave us that very poignant example around how people are managing with cigarettes, but we've also talked about the escalation of vaping. And we're going to have a whole other town hall around e-cigarettes and vaping and how that has become really prolific in our schools as well. So if we're trying to tell our young people not to fight, if we're saying not to resort to violence, what should they be doing? What can we realistically say? Because we tell our young people to walk away. And in many cases, people say that's not always possible. But the cost has become so staggering. We've just heard yesterday in Philadelphia, 5 teenagers shot, 1 killed, coming off the field at Roxborough High School. This is the inability to not escalate it's an act of bravery. What should we be telling our young people? Dr. G, I want to start with you this time.
Oh, actually, could I give my time to Miss Hall?
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yes.
I'll come back. I'm not off the hook. But
that's
Ms.
okay.
Hall was like ready to go. I'm like, oh, I wouldn't listen to what Miss Hall has to say. Over to you, LaQuisha.
Thank you, Dr. G. I was actually looking forward to following you. But I do want to start with saying that we do tell them to walk away from violence, but we don't tell them where to walk to. We don't tell them how that walk should look. And we don't tell them what they already have within them that in enrolls them in a space where they can walk away and not feel defeated, discouraged, or, as they say, looking like a punk, So one of the things that I was able to do as an educator in my classroom, and some people might say that it was like a psychological thing that I did, but I was always calling them scholars, identifying what a scholar is. I would say things like, if they got to a place where they started to behave or act a certain way that I felt was out of their character, I would say that to them directly. That's not who you are. Or, so I think we speak so much about who our young people are, and it's not always positive. They've heard that so much that they've internalized it to the point where their worth internally is not as strong as what they feel their worth is externally, which is why they're so attentive and in tune to what they're wearing, how their hair looks, how long their nails are. Those things are super important to them because they're trying to control something so you see value in them. And so if we take the time to build the inside of them as much as we might compliment their outfit or talk about how well they play a football game, talk about how intelligent they are, talk about when you walk away, do you know what that is when you walk away? That's courage, that's bravery, that's boldness. They don't hear enough of that. And so as a result, they are not going to walk away when we just say that, because they don't know where to walk to. They don't know that they already have within them what it would take for them to not only successfully walk away, but walk to something better. Where are you going after you walk away from this violence? What will your day or your life look like tomorrow if you avoid this fight? And honestly, Dr. Anderson, this conversation does not just need to be held with young people. We got adults arguing on the internet about the stupidest things.
I agree.
And our kids see that. Not only do they see it, but some of them react to that in a way it makes the job harder for educators. Like, you could be in a space where you're telling a child, I don't want you to fight. And my mama said, or my aunt said, if somebody hit me, I'm gonna hit them back. So if you've already been exposed to this, my one time telling you to walk away is not going to be as impactful. And so we have to change the conversation around the kids and to our kids. We got to stop talking about Baltimore City kids in front of them, what we think that means, what that might have meant to us historically, because where we're going in the future is not what it was in the past. And then also build them up in a way that may not have been done before. And initially, they'll push back. Some of my kids didn't want to be called scholar at the beginning. They didn't know what it was. Okay. But I had to continuously say it, continuously teach it. They saw how others were reacting to that teaching, and they all eventually complied because they were like, I want that too. Yeah. But are we giving them what they want? We don't know what they want because we're not instilling that in them.
And one thing that I can say as a former principal that also used to really be a part of the conversations I had when two students presented in my office around conflict was, who are the other people who are party to this, who didn't throw a punch, but got to maybe instigate, got to maybe shout out a few things, right? Because we often know, as Councilman Cohen said, that the escalation that happens often happens because you've got a crowd. And now people want to be entertained. And so much of what this violence has been a response to young people's pride, right? They have pride. So you talk about the courage to walk away, but we live in a culture where people are grappling for likes. They think that likes are what make them relevant in the world. In social media, to get a like or a red heart, it means it doesn't mean what people think it means. And our young people are really allowing so many instigators to hype up situations that they don't then know how to de-escalate. And that is unfortunate. And it's unfortunate again, because so many of the adults, we are blind to it. We are not seeing that. And so we don't know how to help our young people to unpack that in a safe way. So when we talk about conflict de-escalation, right, and having a trauma-informed response, we also have to talk about the people who stand on the sidelines and throw rocks and throw stones, even though they're not necessarily one of the people who are in the conflict itself.
But if I may, real quick, I
Mhm.
truly do believe that, again, that building the individuals involved, they can surpass pride if they are built high enough. Like if we help them build that wall high enough, they can walk away. I can very quickly tell you the story. When Melinda Anderson was in my classroom
Mhm.
observing me to becoming a teacher, there was a day when my students were doing independent reading, and it was always completely silent in my classroom during that time. So she's typing in the corner, I'm taking attendance in the other corner. Well, we all of a sudden heard this it was a fight in the hallway.
Mm.
It was a lot of commotion. My door was closed. Melinda was completely alarmed. She got up. She didn't know if she should go out or whatever.
Mhm.
Myself and the students continued to do what we were doing. The kids continued to read, and I continued to take attendance. But I did look up because I noticed she was like kind of frantic. So she said to me after the class, she said, "How did you do that? How did you get the kids to like be still and not be running to the door and trying to see what was happening and all that?" And I told her, I said, "We don't have that culture in my classroom. I don't teach, I built them up enough." So I told them, if something's happening outside that door, I will protect you inside of it. I'm gonna make sure that everything you're trying to accomplish in here will happen. So if you want to read that book right now, you keep reading that book and you don't have to go to the door. And so that's why they didn't move. But I think without that building up, the front loading of all that they need internally, my class would have been at that door just like other classes were. We could hear so many kids in the hallway. My class was probably the only one that wasn't in the hallway. And that's an example of how the kids can push past that pride. I know they wanted to know who was fighting. They probably wanted to see it. But because they knew I saw something different in them, and I saw them as not being what they were hearing, they stayed in place. And I think they had an audience. Classroom with 30 kids. They could have been looking at each other like testing to see who's gonna get up and what's Miss Hall gonna do. Nobody did that.
Yes, you raise the expectations for them as learners, and that's what good teachers do. So thank you. We have another question saying, we see violence not just in our schools, but we also see it in road rage. We had this summer the unfortunate shooting of a squeegee kid right downtown. And so, people are asking, what can we do as adults in Baltimore? Because we see so much just happening in our streets. I'm going to throw that to you, Councilman Cohen.
Could I actually kick this one to my friend, Dr. G?
Oh, okay. Well,
Well, so I'm gonna
and I'll come back if you want.
Got it. All right. So I'm gonna take the road rage though to kind of just put it back into a context. A little bit on the responsibility of medicine, but I'm hoping what I say here, everyone kind of begins to think about. Because again, if you've been to a doctor's office, we ask certain questions that we think we're comfortable with, like, are you exercising? What does exercise look like for you? Are you eating well? And what does it look like for you? I don't think we ask, how do you deal with conflict?
Yeah.
I don't think we ask, how do you deal with stress? Yeah. And here, over at Hopkins, specifically at the Bayview campus, we're trying to change that culture. You got to ask patients this, right? Because their conflicts, they're going to find, as we talked about earlier, with trauma and so forth, unhealthy ways of dealing with it. So ask your patients, right? It's going to get uncomfortable. Of course it is. But if they can discuss like how they want to handle traumas, how they want to handle their conflicts potentially, how they're handling their stress, you can also begin to tease out the unhealthy parts of it. Because, going back to the smoking example, what I love is like patients are like, oh yeah, quit. Life was good. Someone died. I went back to smoking. Okay. That means no one has prepared you as an adult of how to handle this stress. We got to have these conversations. We have to. Because I'm hoping then it does extend itself, not just, to physical world, but yet to the cars. I mean, watching adults suddenly not, have the adult-like behavior that we want, it's astonishing. So I think we have to be more comfortable with these conversations. How do you handle yourself at the worst? If you're not preparing yourself mentally for that, you will not be prepared for the consequences of what you will do. And I think we need to get comfortable, even as healthcare professionals, to have that question. One last comment I'll make, I don't know if there's truth to this, but I'll say it out loud. Ever since 83 has added tons of speed cameras, demanding us to drive at that. It's been, yeah, I'm probably a little bit late to work, but it's comfortable. Like, no one is swerving to cut me off. It doesn't feel like I'm driving down a racetrack. So I don't know if Councilman Cohen has data behind it, but 83 seems a little bit safer to me since those speed cameras were added. So maybe there's a higher accountability we hold people to behave. But nonetheless, I'll pass it over to others now.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know in terms of data yet, but it's a good question. And, I think complete streets and anything we can do to slow cars down at this point is probably a good idea. Look, I do think that part of the next 2+ years of the pandemic are going to be squarely around mental health. COVID hopefully will not continue to have the same devastating physical impacts that it's had in the past, as we all hopefully are getting vaccinated and triple and quadruple boosted. But I think it really did something really profound to our mental health. And just personalize it, I find myself getting frustrated and angry and having to be like, wait a minute, like, this is not that big a deal, in ways that pre-pandemic honestly didn't have to do. I think that sitting in Zoom world for indeterminate amounts of time, and that's for those of us that are privileged enough to have a computer and to be able to work online. For folks that weren't and didn't, it's infinitely worse. People who had to go and be servers or go and do Amazon labor during the pandemic, and both suffered more physically, but also just didn't have the kind of love and support that we poured on certainly our medical professionals, and they, don't get me wrong, deserved it 100%. But I think a lot about folks who serve in our kitchens, and nobody thanked that. Nobody did the hand clap when they came home. Folks who serve, who put the packages together at Amazon and who we know got sick a lot. I just think that one of the things that the pandemic has done is shorten everyone's fuse, make everybody more susceptible to anger and rage, and that quickly tips into violence. And I think when we talk about road rage or folks reacting in a really overly irrational and intense way toward kids that are squeegeeing, I do think that some of that comes from just our own intense anxiety and feelings of being trapped that I think so many of us have collectively experienced. And I think it's going to take a really long time for us to even kind of wrap our minds around that piece of this virus. But I see it in so many different spaces. I think saying it out loud and acknowledging it is one piece. And then, being able to get help. I mean, there's been times where, I've turned to counseling, and that's been really helpful for me. That's, I think it can be good for some folks and not as good for others, but just to say that, it's okay to not be feeling okay, and that all of us, whether you're, a city council person or anyone else, has struggled over the last couple of years in one way or another. So just want to acknowledge that. Thank
you. Appreciate that. And then Mrs. Hall, I'm going to give you the final comment of the evening. I see that we're already at time, but there's just so much more that we could say, so much more that we could discuss, but I want to give you for tonight the final comment.
I appreciate that, Dr. Anderson. First of all, I have really appreciated hearing from everyone here in this space, and I've read a couple of comments coming through online as well. So I'm really grateful for the people who are coming to these conversations. Regardless of where we stand with this issue, what we think we should do in order to make progress, who we think should do what work. I just want to ask everybody to keep in mind that Jasmine, one of my former scholars, his last night was one of the best nights of his life. He went to his prom, he looked impeccable. He was looking forward to graduating from high school. He was a great boxer. He participated in one of those after school clubs like Dr. G had mentioned earlier. And I am incredibly heavy with the fact that in his prom suit, he was shot and killed for his material possessions, which means that our kids, our youth are seeing their worth externally and not internally. And so I would like to employ everyone that when you look at a child, to remember Jasmine, that he should be here in his senior year. He should be preparing for graduation. And if you don't find any other reason to support another young person or to be that listening ear, as Councilman Cohen mentioned earlier, remember Jasmine in that moment and maybe take a step that you wouldn't have before. Be brave and say something to a young person that could propel them in a different direction.
Thank you. And I would just add to that, that we as adults have an opportunity to reach out and impact our young people by mentoring. There are lots of opportunities across our city for us to all mentor and to push into the life of a young person. You'll never know the impact that you'll have. So I would encourage everyone who has participated and streamed this conversation this evening to look into an opportunity to be a blessing to someone else, as someone was a blessing to us. And so with that, my dear friends, I want to close our conversation. As I said earlier, there's so much more that we could say. There's so many more conversations that we need to have, so many young people's lives that have been lost in this city, across the country, and we think of them all, of the opportunity and the hope that has been dashed because their lives have been taken. For some of them, and for many others, they have been injured. And so we want to, as the adults in this situation, take responsibility and to continue to have the conversations about how we make change and how we move forward in our city and in our state and across the country and around the world. So I want to thank our three panelists who have joined us this evening. I think this has just been a very difficult topic, but you have brought great bravery in being willing to participate this evening. So to Mrs. LaQuisha Hall, to Councilman Zeke Cohen, and to Dr. Panagis Galiatsatos, I want to thank you. I want to thank our audience for joining and sticking with us. We went over, but we had lots of great questions. We didn't even get to all of them, but I just want to thank so many of you for asking these important questions. We are going to have yet another town hall to continue this conversation, which is going to be more focused on solutions. What are we going to do now and next for the young people of our city? So please keep your eyes and ears open for further details about our in-person town hall on gun violence and school safety, which will be the third part to this series. And so we also want to thank you for joining our HEAT town hall lineup. And we will also be having next month a town hall on the dangers of vaping and e-cigarettes. We know that, as Dr. G said, that the incidences of our young people vaping and using e-cigarettes in schools has exploded. And so we want to talk about that as a response to the trauma and the stress that they are feeling. And we encourage you to join us for that. More information will be forthcoming, so please follow us on our social media channels at JH Connects, as well as JH Heat Core on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, so that you can stay updated with this information. I want to personally thank the amazing team behind HEAT, all of these beautiful people who come with their A game every time we host one of these town halls to make sure that this work is done impeccably. So I want to thank Megan, Olivia, Jackie, and Brittany for being a wonderful production team and making sure that this could come off so well. So thank you to this team. We also want to thank our sponsors, Johns Hopkins University and Medicine and the Johns Hopkins Health System, and my colleagues in the Johns Hopkins School of Education. With that, I am signing off. I am Annette Anderson, Deputy Director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Safe and Healthy Schools. Thank you, thank you, thank you, and good night until we meet again.